Good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's webinar. So we've got a fascinating hour and 15 minutes ahead. So again, as you all know, the report that's been launched today is on the lives of 13-year-olds, and through the use of the Growing Up in Ireland data, we've been able to create this fascinating sort of comparison between the 13-year-olds in Ireland today versus 10 years ago. So good amount of coverage already in the newspapers and on the media of the report, but in the next hour and a bit we're going to have a good deep dive into the findings and some good discussion around this. So I should say this work, although done by the ESRI, is being done in cooperation and collaboration with our colleagues in the Department of Children. We've had a strong relationship with the department for a long number of years now, going back to the origins of the Growing Up in Ireland study. So it's always a great pleasure to be able to take these opportunities to thank departments, in this case the Department of Children, for that ongoing engagement with the Institute. So in a couple of moments I'll call on the Secretary General of the Department, Kevin McCarthy, who will say an opening few words. Then my colleague Emer Smyth will take us through the details of the report. And then I'm delighted to say when Emer has concluded, we will actually have two young teenagers joining us who will give their reflections on the study. So after you've heard from the old folks, we'll move on to youth and hear what they have to say. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So if people want to submit questions, they're welcome to do so through the Q&A function. They're primarily, of course, for Emer. If our two younger colleagues want to participate, they're welcome to. But as I said, the questions really should be for Emer. And just in that context, I've been asked that anybody submitting questions should be cognizant of the fact that there are two younger folks as part of the event today. So if you could just make sure you word things in an appropriate manner, that would be very much appreciated. So with that, Kevin, can I call on you to join us and kick off proceedings? Over to you.
Thanks very much for the invitation this morning, and thanks to yourself and the ESRI, and in particular thanks to Professor Emer Smyth, the author of today's paper, for inviting me to speak at this morning's launch. And just to reflect back on what you said there, Alan, our partnership with the ESRI is really important to us as a department. It has generated, I think, a wealth of policy relevant research in relation to children and young people. Today's report adds to that body of research. It's the latest in a line, and that has been really essential for us in developing and implementing evidence-based policy to improve the lives of children and young people across Ireland, which is what this is all about. Before I talk about today's report, I just want to say a few words about the Growing Up in Ireland study, which as you say is the data source for this report, and indeed the partnership reports that have come before it. Growing Up in Ireland, as most of you will know, is the national longitudinal study of children and young people. It's our department's flagship research project, and I think it's a real national treasure in terms of providing an evidence base and a context for many policy questions across government, following the lives of children and the same group of children and their families from early years through childhood and adolescence and into early adulthood has really deepened our knowledge and understanding of children's development and outcomes, and provides us with a really robust basis for developing policies that can address the identified needs of children and young people. Last year, the Growing Up in Ireland study moved from the ESRI and Trinity College to our department and our partners, the Central Statistics Office. And our objective now is to try to build on the really excellent work of the ESRI and Trinity over the first 2 decades of the study, and there's a lot ongoing. We have the new birth cohort 24 to start this autumn, and consultations with experts preparing for this cohort at age 3 started yesterday and will finish in June. We're also preparing data for researchers on cohort 98 at age 25 and a pilot for cohort 08 at age 17, along with key findings from surveys of cohort 08 at age 13. So a lot of work ongoing, and we can look forward, I hope, to a range of further insights from this in due course. And of course, as I say, none of this would have been possible without the really lead role and the excellence that the ESRI brought to this in stewarding and guiding growing up in Ireland over the previous 13 years. Your work in the ESRI, together with the work of your partners in Trinity College, have meant that growing up in Ireland has earned an international reputation as an exemplar longitudinal project. It has guided policy on children and young people in Ireland since 2006, which is a really significant statement to be able to make, and we're delighted that it continues to benefit from the expertise and experience of the ESRI in a number of ways, and not least through this research partnership, which, as today illustrates again, produces really important outputs using the Growing Up in Ireland data. Today's report, as Alan has already said, is a comparison between the lives of 13-year-olds in 2011, 2012 and 13-year-olds in 2021, 2022. And it's a really useful piece of research that's going to help us as policymakers to identify what has worked well over that decade and what we need to pay more attention to now and into the future. It's notable that the young people, the 13-year-olds for this particular piece of research, cohort 08, were interviewed during the COVID pandemic, and this undoubtedly has had a bearing on some of the responses, and I'm sure Emer will comment further on that. Nevertheless, the Social Worlds at 13 report provides really useful insights now into what has improved over the past decade or so, and helps us to monitor well-being over that time in the context of new policies and various other changes that have taken place over the past decade. A number of the media reports this morning, and Alan mentioned the great coverage that the report has got, I think picked up on the decline for this age group in the number of close friends that they reported as having. And we really don't know what the implications of this might be, but it's something that we will need to track over time. It does lead to the obvious question as to whether fewer close friends, as well as other trends that are reported on, such as those relating to screen time or physical exercise, has any impact on well-being for young people. Does it play any role in mental health issues and anxiety among teenagers, for example? I know these are areas that colleagues are going to be very interested to follow up on. It's really pleasing to see that there have been very positive changes in parent and child relationships. In particular, the paper reports lower levels of conflict between parents and children and increased communication between young people and their parents. And these are very positive findings that point to real progress in how we as a society treat our children and young people. These findings can feed into our work here in the department on the national model of parenting support services, which we launched 2 years ago. The national model, called Supporting Parents, is a whole of government approach to improving parenting supports in order to help parents to feel more confident and informed in their parenting role. The model seeks to improve services by setting out a shared vision with agreed principles and shared goals, and promotes a joined up approach to parenting supports across various sectors. It also aims to expand dedicated support services for particular groups of parents, and again, the findings of today's report are going to help us to target those groups who need further supports. The report also indicates some areas that do really need to be worked on. We see a need to address inequalities in access and inclusion for out-of-school activities, in particular for children and young people who are experiencing disadvantage or disability. And these are worrying discrepancies, not necessarily new, but we don't want any young person, any child or young person to experience barriers to enjoying the full range of activities that they want to access. We also see gender differences here in the type of activities that children and young people are involved in outside of school, and obviously there's an onus on us to ensure that all activities are fully inclusive of all children and young people. So look, there's a lot of really rich data there that helps us to think about the areas of challenge for us as policymakers. And I know that there's another forthcoming report from Emer, which will look at children and young people with disabilities in more detail. And I think when that's available, it'll help to expand on the findings here, and very much look forward to seeing that. One way that our department is supporting young people to access out of school activities is through continued and increased investment in youth work, particularly for young people who are experiencing disadvantage or marginalisation. And again, today's paper just reinforces the importance of our endeavours in this area and of ensuring that all young people have access to those opportunities. Later this year, we'll be publishing a new national strategy on youth work opportunities. So today's report is very timely, in fact, in helping us to inform that policy. And I know it's going to be of direct interest to colleagues across government departments with a range of responsibilities, relating to sport, culture, education, among others. And I know the report will be widely read, and we'll certainly share and disseminate and promote it indeed in our interactions with the relevant government departments. And I know colleagues are here from the Department of Education this morning, for example, and they will be particularly interested in the extensive findings on educational attainment and the impact of revisions to our school curricula over recent years. So look, just thanks again to Emer for your great work on this research, and look forward now to hearing you present in more detail on that. I know I speak for my colleagues across the Department of Children Integration in welcoming the publication of the report. I know it's going to be read with great interest. I should say, as apart from any professional interest I might have, I speak as the parent of a 13-year-old. So the insight that this report gives into the social world of 13-year-olds is of very direct personal interest, I have to say. And as Alan has said, I know we're going to hear directly from some young people later on from Corleon and Oak to hear what they think of the report and what's important to them and any suggestions they have. So I'm really looking forward to that, and can I say a huge thank you to Adam and Rachel for taking time to read the report and to report to us on it. I know Rachel has the small matter of her junior cert next week, so particular thanks to her for giving us the time this morning. But look, thank you to everybody for your attention, and once again, thanks to Alan and Emer and all of the ESRI team for not just for producing this excellent piece of research, but for organising this morning's webinar to share it with us. And I'll hand back to yourself, Alan, will I?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Kevin. I enjoyed your remarks about the being a parent. I always say that the lovely thing about GUI-related webinars, a lot of ESRI research, and needless to say, it's all fascinating, but very often it's of great interest to immediate policymakers or people in particular areas. But the GUI material has always sort of given us a much broader audience because everybody is interested in these sort of topics. So just your remark on that reminded me anyway of the broad audience that is there. Just two other quick things, Kevin, and I know this sort of sounds like sort of mutual congratulatory remarks or whatever, but the great thing about your ongoing support of the research related to GUI is that sometimes organizations, they'll collect the data and they'll fund the data collection, but forget, of course, that data on a, just in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever like that isn't information. It only becomes really information when the analysis is done. So it's great that you and your department have been willing to fund the additional research. And the very last thing I'll say, just by coincidence, I happened to be at an event a couple of weeks ago and was talking to a former minister in your department, Frances Fitzgerald. And Frances has, a very distinguished and long political career, but she was counting the GUI as one of the sort of things she was very proud of, because she was there around the early days of GUI. And it was just, again, really heartening to hear a politician of that experience, with so much experience, attaching such importance to the Growing Up in Ireland survey, the information that has flowed from it. So just lots of positive stuff. But listen, I better leave it there. People are not here to listen to me talk. They're here to hear Emer talk. So Emer, I'm going to invite you now to go through the details of the report, and I presume you'll be sharing a screen as well.
I want to kind of acknowledge a few people first. I want to really thank the Secretary General for his kind words about the research and for the ongoing research partnership we have with the department. I'd like to thank members of the programme steering group, especially Gráinne Collins, for their support. I'd also like to thank Adam and Rachel from Cordan and Oak. It's really great that they're coming along to talk about the research. It's a long time since I've been a teenager, so I think their voices are more authentic. As always, we're really grateful to the Growing Up in Ireland study team and the young people and families without whom this wouldn't have been possible. So just to tell you a little bit about the background of the study, the fact that we have two cohorts of Growing Up in Ireland is really a rich treasure trove because it enables us to look at the experiences of 13-year-olds a decade apart. So those who were 13 in 2011-12 and those who were 13 in 21-22. This was a period of very rapid social, economic and policy change. Not least, we had reform of the junior cycle, we had growing digitalisation of young people's lives, and massively, we had the disruption of the pandemic to all aspects of young people's lives. And we'll see those kind of factors playing out in some of the patterns we see. Now, I want to briefly address kind of three sets of questions today and just give you a flavour of the findings. So I want to look at how have the quality of relationships with parents and peers, experience of learning and day-to-day activities among adolescents changed over a decade. And then to look at whether these changes reflect differences in the characteristics of the young people. And I want to kind of also look at whether changes are more evident for girls and boys or for young people from different family backgrounds. First of all, it's worth pointing out that we're seeing changes in the actual composition of this group over time. We see that they have more highly educated parents. Even in that decade, we see a massive growth in the proportion who have at least one parent with a degree or higher. We see a reduction in financial strain, so families are less likely to say they're having real difficulty making ends meet because this group were surveyed at the tail end of the recession. We're seeing greater cultural diversity with more young people from a migrant origin family, but we're also seeing a shift in housing tenure. So we're seeing a higher proportion of young people who are in rented accommodation. So that could mean private rented accommodation or social housing. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Now, other differences are evident. We see a decline in the size of families, which has been ongoing over time. The proportion in lone parent families is relatively stable. As the Secretary General indicated, we're doing further work on young people with a disability, but we see a really significant increase even in that 10-year period in the proportion of young people who have a long-lasting condition, illness or disability. So in the analysis, we're going to look at changes in young people's lives, but we're also going to look at whether those changes are evident net of changes in those kind of background characteristics, so parental education, greater cultural diversity, and so on. Now, to start with parent-child relationships, it's really a positive picture here. We see a very significant decline over time in conflict with mothers, and in conflict between fathers and their 13-year-olds. And these are reported by the parents, but we also see young people's reports. They see their mothers as more responsive to their needs than previously. But we also see that there's a difference in the kinds of conflict among different kinds of families. So we see conflict is more likely among lone parent families, those living in rented housing, and those in urban areas. And it's also much higher where the young person has a long-standing condition or disability. And we'll be looking at that further in the forthcoming research. But what's interesting is that conflict declined for all groups, but less for some groups than others. We see that the difference is less for girls than for boys. So relationships improved more for boys. And that seems to be related to an increase that we see in emotional difficulties among girls. So these emotional difficulties are fueling greater conflict in the family. And we find across all social groups, we see a fall in conflict, except for those families who are living under financial strain. So financial strain is emerging as a key driver of conflict within the family. We also see that how parents deal with behavior or poor behavior is becoming more democratic. We see a really significant increase in the proportion who say that their parents always explain what they've done wrong, and a much greater a reduction, the group saying they never shout, or they're never shouted at, and they're not grounded. So we see a shift here from more punitive approaches, perhaps, to more explanation and reasoning with the young people, which in turn is intertwined with the lower levels of conflict. Now, turning to peer relationships, what we see this change for both friends as a whole and for close friends. So I'm just going to focus on close friends. So we really see that friendship groups are getting smaller. So young people now are more likely to have 3 or fewer friends. And there's quite a marked reduction in the proportion of young people who have really big friendship groups. So we're talking about 6 or more friends. So that's quite a shift over time. And we weren't seeing that when this group were age 9. In fact, they had slightly growing and networks at age 9. So the shift in that 4-year period is quite stark. We do see differences among groups of young people. Those from migrant origin have fewer friends, as do those with a disability and those living in rented accommodation. And girls tend to have fewer friends than boys, and this gender gap actually widens over time. As we see the network getting smaller, we actually see it's less age diverse. So the younger cohort are less likely to socialize with older peers than was the case 10 years previously. Now, because we had to shift to phone collection for the cohort 08 survey, we had to drop some items. So we don't have as much on relationship quality, but we do have some mother reports rather of peer problems. And we see some increase in peer problems over time, but this is largely driven by the fact that we've more young people of migrant origin with a disability or living in rented housing. So if we turn to day-to-day activities, GY has always had rich information on what young people do in and out of school. Encouragingly, we see an increase in weekly involvement in organised sport, 5 percentage points. But we see a persistence in differences in the groups that are involved. So sports participation is higher among boys than girls. It's much higher among those from more advantaged, so professional or graduate families, and it's lower among those with a disability or of migrant origin. Now, interestingly, involvement improved among all social groups. The exception was those families, again, who are under financial strain. So, there seems to be an issue around participation. And I've heard recently in other fieldwork that the term sport poverty been used. And it does seem to be a potential barrier for that group to engage in organised sport. Now, if we turn to other activities, we see that cultural engagement, so music, drama, arts and crafts increased slightly. Now, the definition changed slightly, so the encouraging news is that it is at least stable, if not increasing. But again, we see big differences. We see that girls are much more likely to take part, as are those from more advantaged families. The Secretary General had mentioned youth work and youth clubs. We see a slight fall off in involvement in these organised groups, but that was at least partly related to the pandemic restrictions that were still evident at the tail end of this period. The measures of reading for pleasure are not fully comparable between the cohorts, but we do see now a very sizable proportion. Just under half of boys from disadvantaged backgrounds are spending little or no time reading. So they're reading less than once a week or never. Not surprisingly, we see a big shift away from traditional media like watching television or playing video games towards other screen-based activities, so using a phone or another device. So I'll just show you that pattern now. So this is the other screen time, and we can see that, 10 years previously, almost a half were spending no time on this, and that's dropped very, very much. But at the upper end, we can see there's been a big increase in those spending a long time. And these are weekdays. These are weekdays during term time. So we don't have information at both cohorts for weekend, but we know for the younger cohort that screen time goes up at the weekend. So we have like around a third are now spending 3 or more hours online during the weekdays. Now, we also have insights into engagement in school and learning. The younger cohort had fully experienced the full rollout of junior cycle reform. So they had a new curriculum, but also had experienced some new approaches to teaching and learning in junior cycle, but also earlier in primary school because changes had happened there as well. Now, interestingly, though, we see there's a kind of slight fall in those who say they like school very much. There's no change in those who hate school, but we see it here. And that's really driven by the fall among girls. Over a third in the older cohort of girls like school very much, compared to under a quarter now. And that pattern seems to be related to greater emotional difficulties among girls. So like the parental conflict patterns, we see that kind of these emotional difficulties are kind of feeding into more disengagement from school overall. But when it turns to individual subjects, the picture is much more positive. We can see improvements in attitudes, finding maths interesting, finding English interesting, and finding science interesting. And this is quite a high level of positive feelings around maths. Not so positive for Irish. We can see an increase in those who say it's not interesting. Now, I've covered quite a lot very, very quickly, but just to talk a little bit more about the implications of some of these findings and to draw the main themes together. First of all, we've seen improvement in many aspects of young people's lives. We see they have more democratic family relationships and less conflict with their parents. We see improvements in their engagement in sport and physical exercise, and we see greater interest in some of their core school subjects like math, science, and English. But on the other hand, we see smaller friendship groups and poorer peer relations. We also see relatively low levels of reading for pleasure. But what's interesting is what we see in terms of the lives of young people according to their gender and their social background. We see a real persistence of gender differences in young people's day-to-day lives. Girls are much more involved in cultural activities and reading, and boys are much more involved in sport and hard physical exercise. Now, we know from our previous research using Growing Up in Ireland that these differences emerge very early, even at the preschool level, in terms of what kinds of play children engage in. And as the Secretary General mentioned, it's important that we really ensure that in and out of school settings seek to provide all young people with access to a range of activities from their early years onwards. And the expansion of the kind of early years provision to 2 years provides a basis for providing access to more arts and cultural activities and to more physical activities. Now, we see too gender stereotyping and attitudes to school subjects. So girls are more positive about English and Irish than boys, and boys are more positive about maths and science. But what is concerning is that we're actually seeing a widening rather than a narrowing gender gap in interest in STEM over time. And that is concerning given there's been quite a strong policy focus on promoting STEM among girls, but we're still seeing this widening gap. And we're seeing emerging evidence that there are greater emotional difficulties among girls and that these are impacting on their family relationships and school engagement. And we need to go in deeper to kind of unpack why that's happening, whether it's the aftermath of the pandemic or a shift in digital engagement, because we see that the gender pattern of online activity has really changed. So boys were earlier adopters, but girls now are spending more time online than their male peers. And we also see very persistent social inequalities in young people's lives. So young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, according to different measures, parental education, family structure, housing tenure, they're less likely to take part in various out of school activities. So this includes sport, other forms of hard exercise, cultural activities, and reading. And this has really strong implications for the social gap that we see in cognitive and health outcomes among young people, and will have longer term consequences then. So I think the findings reinforce the need for subsidised activities in communities and supports for schools to provide access to a wide range of extracurricular options. And finally, we see that financial strain is emerging as an important driver of friction between parents and their children, highlighting the need for targeted income supports for families with children in order to reduce this conflict and enhance their well-being.
Thank you so much for that, Emer. Lots and lots of fascinating results. We'll get to them in a moment. Brilliant. Okay, so Adam, you're very welcome to this ESRI event. We're really grateful that you're going to share your thoughts with us. So with that, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So hi, everybody. My name is Adam. And Rachel and I are here representing young people of Corlin and Nogue and commenting on the findings of this study. Before I get started, I'd like to say thank you so much for the ESRI for inviting us and for the National Participation Office for facilitating our attendance. So to start off, I believe the lives of 13-year-olds have changed drastically in the last decade. Between the effects of the pandemic and the growing presence of technology in young people's lives, being 13 is no easy task. I think as we get older, even me being just 3 years since I was 13, we forget just how personal the journey into adolescence is. How little things like friendships and day-to-day activities have such an impact on how we feel and how we live. A lot of the time, people can look at the life of 13-year-olds and think it's unstressful or more simplistic. But I think right now we're all living in the same world. With the cost of living crisis, wars going on across the world, we can agree it's a scary time to be alive. But it's especially scary for young people. What kind of future are young people in Ireland looking towards? So across the board, I think the issues facing young people in Ireland were reflected quite well in the research. But when reading it, I definitely noticed that those who are living in rented accommodation from migrant origin or have a disability are consistently found to be disadvantaged. No matter the area, the most vulnerable young people in our society are constantly under-supported. Another thing that definitely struck me about the findings was the link between the increase in both families who are renting and those with a degree. This, again, says so much for the future that these 13-year-olds are looking at. It was interesting to see how much our housing crisis fed into young people's lives and complex social issues. I'm definitely not the first person to say that we need more affordable housing or more sustainable cities, but I am another person saying it and another young person, which is definitely just as important. Additionally, I was concerned about how cultural, sporting, and additional academic activities are much more popular amongst those of advantaged and graduated families. I agree with what Emer was just saying there. Subsidized activities are absolutely necessary to get people of all backgrounds into a range of interests. But the actual excitement and passion around these interests is so key. Like this year in my own school, where debating had a much greater uptake with people of all backgrounds because of promotion, non-competitive opportunities, and extremely passionate organisers. So many activities like debate, learning an instrument, or sport are simply inaccessible for people because of the price and lack of promotion for them. Continuing on from this, I was definitely saddened by the fall in involvement for other youth organised groups, like youth clubs. Obviously, as a member of Corlin and Nogue, this is something I'm an advocate for, but I can see the barriers and stigmas around joining such groups amongst young people. From the pandemic, we saw an increase in online meetings, but so much of what youth engagement is that personal connection. connecting with other young people from across Ireland, representing their own communities, and seeing similarities and differences between you all. Again, I saw a worrying increase in overall negative attitudes, especially among girls, about school. Rachel and I have just become new members of the Corlin and Oak National Executive, and will be working on a topic surrounding mental health and school stress for the next 2 years. We can definitely affirm the findings on negative attitudes towards school, as this topic was voted on and debated by over 160 delegates in second level education at Dáil na nÓg in March. We saw people mention struggles about the CAO system and how impersonal it is, or how there are issues with inadequate guidance teams in schools. We hope to work on this topic further in National Executive and hope you follow along our journey too. Finally, similar to what I last said, there's a conflicting increase in negative attitudes toward Irish in school, considering how much of an increase it has taken with adults post-second level. But there's still a strong opposition to learning Irish in school. So it made me think, how can we extend that love for Irish down to young people who are learning it on a daily basis? I think definitely a more casual and spoken approach to language learning would benefit Irish young people's view of our culture and our past. So in conclusion, there's definitely positive and negative angles at which the lives of 13-year-olds have changed. But I think remembering the fundamental values of kindness and supportiveness, which are drilled into you as a child and adolescent, is something everyone here can take back today and learnings from the changing social worlds of 13-year-olds. So that's all of my response for now. I hope you found some value in what I've been saying and can take these suggestions and concerns forward. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. That was really, really fascinating. Probably more interesting than you realize, because genuinely we don't hear from your age group often enough. The fact that you were talking about housing as well, very, very striking. And I have to say, great, that reflection on the Irish language issue. It was a sort of a passing item on Emer's slides, but just that ongoing difficulty of engaging people positive with the Irish language, it just struck me as the slides were going through. So I was interested that you picked up on that. So listen, let's move on to Rachel very, very quickly. So Rachel, I'm just going to invite you to join us here. Again, sincere thanks from all of us for joining us, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, my name is Rachel, and I'm from Offaly Corlin na nÓg. I was born in 2009, so I'm very close to the 08 cohort and have basically grown up in the exact same environments and with the exact same standards. So I quickly want to talk on 3 topics from the report. I want to talk on the peer relations, day-to-day activities, and the engagement at school. So on the peer relationships, what struck me a lot was that friend groups of 6+ have decreased by 12.6. I think more integration is needed with students from the opposite gender, those who are older, and those from disadvantaged or migrant backgrounds. I feel like it is not that it is not discouraged for all of these groups to mix, but it is definitely not encouraged. And as somebody who has friends from many backgrounds, I see a lot of other people who don't, and I think this needs to be encouraged more in school and outside of school. And leading on to outside of school, I want to talk on the day-to-day activities. There was an increase in those who are involved in organised sport, but it was higher among boys than girls. I think that it needs to be more inclusive with girls and those with disabilities and those under financial strain. Girls along with disabilities need to be given more support and promotion when it comes to taking part in organised sport. It needs to have more financial support as well, so that those under financial strain can participate and have the same experience. And then on the cultural engagement, it was higher from those from advantaged families. And from my experience, there is a big block when it comes to disadvantaged families trying to take part in cultural engagement. I believe this critically leads to boys from disadvantaged families not reading as much than those from other families. I think it needs to be made more accessible for those in less advantaged areas, maybe by having things like fees subsidised, or it to be brought into school curriculums so that everybody can learn from it and have cultural engagement. And the final thing I want to speak on is the engagement in school. This is very important to me as I've been experiencing the new junior cycle reform, and I'm sitting the junior cycle next week, so I know exactly what it's like. I first want to speak on the decrease in girls who like school very much. It decreased from 35% to 23%. From my personal experience, there is not an equality in expectations on girls, and girls are held to a more higher standard in school. And this leads to pressure before exams. More support is needed for girls as they're not given the support they need for this extra pressure. I believe day-to-day activities and peer groups lead straight to this pressure that girls feel in school. And I feel like if they are worked on, this will result in school becoming more enjoyable for girls. I would then like to speak on the fact that science had an increase in it being interesting, and around 70% of people said that they found science interesting. From my experience in the junior cycle, science has become a lot more interactive, and I myself am very interested. And along with all my peers, like science is a lot of people's favorite subjects. And I believe that the fact that the course has become more interactive has led to the increase. I think other subjects, especially Irish, need to follow this. And to have subjects more engaging, I feel will make people enjoy them more and learn easier. And the final thing I want to talk about is that girls are less interested in STEM, as this does bounce off the last point. Girls need to be encouraged in STEM at an earlier age. As from my experience, girls are introduced in STEM nearly at a secondary school age, whereas a lot of male counterparts who I go to school with have been introduced in STEM at a very early age. I think more support and encouragement is needed when it comes to girls being in STEM. I know a lot is being done, but I think it needs to be introduced earlier and more normalised, as I feel like girls in STEM is seen as like, oh, wow, it's amazing there's a girl in STEM, but I think it needs to be more normalised and seen just as equal as a boy in STEM. So yeah, that is everything I would like to say. And thank you very much for having me.
Great. Again, Rachel, really fascinating insights. And I mean, again, some of your comments on girls in STEM, I mean, those are just so important because, again, sort of reading the ESRI research over the years of this, we often find that male-female differences that you might be looking at them at one age, but the source of them is actually much earlier in life. And so increasingly we sort of find that trying to address inequalities too late is actually very, very difficult. So having your reflections on that has just been fantastic. So sincere thanks to both of you. So Emer, there's questions coming in on the Q&A already, so I'm going to try and feed them to you. And if Rachel, Adam, or indeed Kevin want to come in at any point, you're more than welcome to do so. So we could just get rolling then, Emer. First question from an anonymous attendee was whether or not there was any consultation with the Irish Traveller Research Policy Organisation in formulating the report. So you might talk about that more generally, about where travellers sort of fit into the GOI framework.
Yeah, well, traveller children and young people are including in growing up in Ireland, but even though the numbers in the sample are really big, we still don't have big enough numbers of traveller children and young people to be able to identify them separately. So that is an issue. So we can't really speak to their experience, unfortunately, using available data. You know, because it's 1% of the population, we find that unless there's a bespoke study, they really can't investigate them. The census as well is a really rich source, but there's a lot more that could be done in that space.
Sure. Thanks for that. Next question then from Marianne O'Kane Bull. Can you please comment further on reading for pleasure and any insights that you have on this, Emer? So I know there were results around reading for pleasure, and I think it was the declines in particular for boys, but do you want to elaborate basically on the findings or the implications?
Yeah, basically the kind of patterns are both continuity and change. We did work earlier in consultation with, in collaboration with the Arts Council, looking at cultural activities, including reading in greater detail. And we found, even for the older cohort at 9 and 13, really stark differences by gender and social background. And gender is even more important than you might think. We're finding at that stage that the levels of reading among middle-class boys were around the same as the levels of reading for working-class girls. So it's almost like there's kind of two sets of social worlds out there in terms of reading for pleasure. Now, we can't directly compare the measures, but we do see very large levels of not reading for pleasure almost at all among boys in particular, and disadvantaged boys, but the pattern for all boys is quite stark too. And that measure included things like reading Kindles or reading, books online. So it wasn't just that it was kind of hard copy books. So it is of concern, and that reading pattern does emerge early. We even see a slight difference in reading to children by the child's gender when these children were 3 and 5.
I was going to ask you that. Is another one of these issues that it really begins very, very early on?
Yeah, we saw that even with things like painting and drawing with the 3-year-olds. I mean, there's no reason that should be gender stereotyped, really, given the male dominance of the art world. But we saw that parents were more likely to for their children to paint or draw on a very regular basis if they were daughters rather than sons.
Yeah. Actually, just sticking with the issue, the parents, okay, and I'm just going to ask a question here because you've raised the issue. One of the really striking charts that you put up was this idea of parents, I think more democratic parenting, I think was the word you used, and sort of more explaining rather than punishment or sanction or whatever like that. Is that a change in parenting style, or is that again related to the economics of 2011 when there seemed to be a lot of financial stress or whatever? Any sort of sense as how that's evolving?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can fully answer it. I remember in one of the reviews of the report, someone raised the issue about whether, the democratic parenting was because there are more highly educated parents, but in fact it doesn't pan out that simply. That middle class parents are more democratic in their approach. In fact, there's quite a difference. I think that the main difference was that middle class parents were more likely to take the phone off the kid, which I didn't show on the chart. I'm not sure it's just economic reasons, so that might play a part, but I think it's part of a broader cultural shift that's been ongoing since we were probably children. You can see it even in the policy domain. We've a way to go, but there's been a lot more emphasis on young people's voice. We have Corlin and Og, and Adam and Rachel spoke really insightfully about the issues for them. So I think we've moved our headspace to kind of regarding children and young people as having valued and valuable comments to make on their lives.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that. Another more straightforward question here from an anonymous attendee. They're asking, if you like, could you give what the study means by emotional difficulties regarding it? I guess this was the question of how it's measured when we use that phrase.
So what we use is the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, and that's got like subscales. So it would have conduct difficulties, peer problems, concentration hyperactivity, and then emotional difficulties. So they kind of broadly group into what are called internalizing difficulties and then externalizing or acting out. So the emotional difficulties would capture things around, the child or young person being very emotional, being quick to cry, getting very upset by things, those kinds of items. And so that we've used that as kind of every wave of growing up in Ireland. So it really allows us to look at changes over time and between cohorts.
Yeah, and I see actually, I see Fiona Daly had a similar question. So Fiona, I hope Emer's addressed your question there. Claire Walsh has a question, and I'm going to read this one, Emer, because there's a few lines in it. In terms of the persistent social inequalities regarding sporting opportunity, is the disparity primarily due to young people from more affluent backgrounds participating in activities outside of school? Okay, possible explanation one. Or does the data also reflect inequalities in extracurricular activities offered within schools, which are often organised by schools on a voluntary basis? So any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, we didn't look at it for this wave, but definitely we see differences in extracurricular provision across different kinds of school. So we see more emphasis on sport, for example, in boys' schools and then in girls' schools. And we see kind of a little bit less emphasis on sport in DEIS schools, so schools serving more disadvantaged backgrounds. But we're not capturing very precisely how much of this they're doing outside school, after school in the school grounds or outside school altogether. So we would view those as complementary. For example, in more rural areas, it tends to be on smaller schools. It's harder to provide sports extracurricular provision because people are getting the school bus. And there you have local community-based GAA type activities playing a bigger role. Whereas in Dublin, you would have kind of you have both going on, but you would have probably a stronger emphasis on the school. But we need to revisit those figures to look at extracurricular provision after the pandemic. Certainly before the pandemic, DEIS schools were doing quite a lot of heavy lifting on cultural activities and helping to kind of bridge that gap a bit and encourage cultural activities, music, choir, in particular dance classes among children and young people.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question here. People are clearly struck by this issue of increasing emotional difficulties amongst girls. And the question here, again, I'll read out the question. The increase in emotional difficulties for girls seems to be similar across the world. Okay, so I guess this is something that's cropping up elsewhere. Any speculation what is and is not driving this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $100 question or $1 million question probably at this stage. Look, we need to go further with this. I think there's two sets of factors that are definitely there. The pandemic, we see that, in terms of well-being during the height of the pandemic, girls were faring worse. That it did seem the disruption to social relationships and peer relationships affected them more, or at least they were more likely to report it did. But I think there's a second factor which may be at play, which is the online world. And we're seeing a real reversal in digital engagement by gender. Boys were early adopters, but now girls have overtaken boys in terms of the kind of time they're spending online. We don't have a lot of detail because the survey had to be shortened to be delivered on a phone. But there's a lot of reports internationally about social media fueling kind of poor body image among girls. The Millennium Cohort study in the UK showed that. So I think those two sets of factors have to be disentangled.
Yeah, because I have to say, again, bringing certain results together, and if we focus on the one we talked about, the greater emotional difficulties, screen use, but also the reduction in the number of friends, you know what I mean, the scale of the network, it does point a picture of sort of degrees of isolation or something like that, which has to be a little bit troubling. Now, I know it may be pandemic related, but I was also adding to this, actually, the decline in family size. So again, if previously you might have thought that, you're a large family or a large-ish family sort of provided a friendship network, if that's diminishing, the size of the friendship is diminishing, it does paint a picture, as I said, of isolation. And back to that issue again of the long-term effects of that, I think would be quite troubling. So I don't know again if that's sort of something that struck you.
Yes, it would be of concern. I mean, there's actually, in a way, a positive thing from friendships becoming less age diverse, in that, having a lot of older friends can be a risk factor for some things like antisocial behavior or early drinking or sexual activity. But yeah, it does potentially point that way. I think when we follow this group at 17, I think we'll get a better handle. But I certainly think in policy terms, we haven't paid enough attention to the impact of the pandemic and the issues around mental health. Okay,
and actually,
sure.
Let me just read it, because there is another question here on a sort of a related theme. And again, it's just easier if I read it out rather than trying to paraphrase. So would you say that there might be a correlation between the decrease in amount of friendships and peer interaction with the fact that schools are pushed to focus more and more on curriculum and exams rather than developing social interactions and peer relationships? So again, that's sort of connecting a range of possible factors. Can you disentangle them?
That's interesting, though. I think two comments. One is that there is, to be fair, I think a stronger emphasis on well-being and promoting well-being in schools than there previously was. Now, whether that's enough, I would argue not. but there certainly is there. It is there. The issue of pressure to cover the exams, the backwash effect of the Leaving Cert, how that talks about the kind of stress issues that Adam mentioned, Corlin and Og are working on. I mean, I'm in the game long enough to have seen that way back. That's not a new issue. Kind of back in the mid-90s, Damien Hannan collected information. We analysed that, and we were finding like about 2/3 of Leaving Cert girls were losing sleep over worry. So that's not a today issue. I think there's something else going on as well as school stress, but I'm not denying the role of school stress.
Okay. And just again, this is more a question for me. Interested that, okay, so this group is 13. Are you optimistic that transition year still offers the potential to allow for the space, for example, to develop the peer groups, to look at subjects because you're interested in them rather than you have to do them? And I say this partly, I mean, Emer, I'm not an expert on educational matters at all, but I was at an event recently where somebody who does know a lot about education was talking about transition year as being potentially the most valuable year actually in people's school careers, even though it's sort of dismissed, by some. So again, that's my question to you. Does TY offer the opportunity to sort of iron out some of the difficulties that are being identified here?
I mean, it's been a while since we've looked at it in detail, but yeah, I am very optimistic. I'm very positive about the results of transition year. I think it gives people time to reflect on the direction they're taking, the subjects they'd be taking, where they might go in the future, gives them some exposure to the world of work. It gives them a diversity of activities. It's a bit of an oasis, in the context of quite an exam-focused system. But as we've said before, it would be good to get some of that kind of variety and different approaches embedded in the rest of senior cycle. We have senior cycle reform underway, but it's possibly not going as far as some of us might prefer. But certainly it can be positive. But on the other hand, we can't expect TY to do the heavy lifting on the severe issues around mental health that we're seeing now. I mean, that has to be a sustained policy effort.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think we were coming to the end of the sort of the questions that are coming in, Emer, and we finished a little bit earlier in terms of presentation, so we've given you a good run in terms of answering the questions. So I might bring things to a close at this point, but just to congratulate you once again, Emer, on a fantastic study. And again, it's one of these sort of things. I mean, I think in terms of the discussion that we're just having, I guess a good research report asks as many questions or prompts as many questions as it actually answers. And certainly on this occasion, there really is so much material there that we really need to think through this. Of course, I want to thank Kevin for his earlier remarks and engagement with the study. I want to thank everybody for coming along or logging on anyway today and submitting questions. But I think the special thanks today goes to Adam and Rachel. So Adam and Rachel, if we were in the ESRI in person, you'd be getting a huge round of applause right now. So unfortunately, we can't organise that. But believe me when I say it, I know myself and Emer are really impressed and grateful, and I know everybody on the call exactly will have appreciated that as well. So sincere congratulations. Siobhan, I see is that a hand up you'd like to say, or is that a hand clap?
That was a hand clap and hit the wrong one.
No worries. Well, listen, it's well appreciated all around. Okay, so with that, let you all go, and I'm sure we'll be doing exactly this again before too long. So anyway, enjoy the rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.